Behind the glittering walls of Spain's royal palace lived a man whose name still echoes with scandal and shame. Ferdinand VII was not remembered as a noble king or a wise ruler, but as a monarch whose desires turned darker than anyone could have imagined. He was once celebrated as El Decido, the Desired One, but that name soon twisted into irony as his perversions and cruelty unfolded. What truly happened inside those locked chambers? Why did his wives live in fear? And how did his secret obsessions shape the destiny of an entire kingdom? Every whisper from the past reveals something more shocking, more disturbing, and more impossible to believe. This is not just the tale of a king, it is the haunting mystery of how power, lust, and corruption can destroy both a man and the nation he was sworn to protect. In the history of Europe, kings and queens have often been remembered for their power, their conquests, their reforms, or even their cruelty. But rarely do we find a monarch remembered almost entirely for his vices, his scandals, and his shocking perversities. Ferdinand VII of Spain was one such king. Born in 1784 into the Bourbon dynasty, he came into a world of turmoil, with Spain's golden age long behind it and its empire already beginning to crumble. Yet even amid political instability, no one could have predicted that Ferdinand would become one of the most reviled rulers in Spanish memory. He would not be remembered for saving his people, or even for leading them in war, but instead for his bizarre appetites, his obsession with control, and the way he turned his personal desires into political weapons. His reign would become a cautionary tale of how corruption, lust, and weakness at the top can poison an entire kingdom. As a young boy, Ferdinand was not destined to be king. He was the son of Charles IV of Spain and Queen Maria Luisa of Parma, a royal family that was already embroiled in scandals. His mother, Maria Luisa, was whispered to have had numerous affairs, some even suggesting that Ferdinand's true father might not have been Charles IV at all. These rumors would haunt Ferdinand's early life, filling him with insecurity and bitterness. Growing up in the shadow of such rumors, Ferdinand began to develop a resentful personality, always distrustful, always suspecting betrayal, and always craving validation. This craving would later twist itself into perverse desires, where he sought not love but control, not affection but humiliation of those closest to him. As a teenager, Ferdinand watched Spain fall into chaos. The French Revolution had erupted across the border, shaking monarchies throughout Europe to their core. The rise of Napoleon Bonaparte further destabilized the continent. Spain, once a mighty empire, was now a fragile and divided kingdom. It was during this period that Ferdinand began to cultivate his own image as El Decido, the Desired One. He promoted himself as the hope of Spain, the prince who would one day restore the glory of his nation. But this was nothing more than a facade. Behind closed doors, Ferdinand was already showing signs of cruelty, manipulation, and obsession with controlling others. His own letters reveal a man who thrived on deceit, who relished in plotting against his father, and who longed to be adored while secretly despising almost everyone around him. In 1808, the moment arrived when Ferdinand's ambitions collided with reality. With Napoleon's armies pressing into Spain, Ferdinand seized the opportunity to dethrone his own father, Charles IV. He painted himself as the savior of Spain, declaring that only he could protect the nation from French domination. For a brief moment, the people cheered him. They believed in the young prince who promised change, who promised strength, who promised to rid Spain of corruption. But Ferdinand's triumph was short-lived. Napoleon, always the master manipulator, lured Ferdinand into a trap. He invited him to Bayonne in France, under the pretense of negotiations. There, Napoleon forced Ferdinand to abdicate the throne, stripping him of the crown he had schemed so hard to seize. Instead, Napoleon placed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as king of Spain. For the next 6 years, Ferdinand lived as a prisoner in France. It was during this captivity that many of his darker tendencies began to grow. Isolated, humiliated, and stripped of power, Ferdinand obsessed over revenge. But instead of maturing into a wiser, stronger leader, he became bitter, paranoid, and twisted. His captivity only deepened his sense of betrayal and desire for domination. He developed a fixation on loyalty, particularly the loyalty of women. He began to shape the worldview that would define his later reign, that everyone was a traitor waiting to betray him, and that he could only trust someone if he completely controlled and humiliated them. This mentality would later manifest in his marriages, where his perversions became notorious, shocking even by the standards of European courts. When Napoleon finally fell and Ferdinand was restored to the throne in 1814, the Spanish people rejoiced. They welcomed him back with open arms, showering him with adoration. They called him again El Decido, the Desired One, believing that their king would lead them into a new age of freedom. After years of occupation and chaos, Spain longed for stability, and they thought Ferdinand would deliver it. But the man who returned to Madrid was not a savior. He was a broken, vindictive, and deeply perverted ruler who cared little for the needs of his people and everything for his own pleasures. His first acts as king were not reforms, not rebuilding, but vengeance. He abolished the liberal constitution of 1812, which had given Spain its first taste of democracy, and restored absolute monarchy. He persecuted liberals, imprisoned dissenters, and turned Spain into a nation of fear. While his country lay in ruins, Ferdinand turned his attention to indulgence, both in power and in the private chambers of the palace. It was in his marriages that Ferdinand's true nature was revealed. His first wife, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples, was young, intelligent, and full of life. She hoped to bring vitality to the Spanish court. But Ferdinand crushed her spirit almost immediately. Obsessed with control, he reduced her to a pawn, constantly humiliating her, mocking her, and subjecting her to his twisted desires. He demanded loyalty, but his definition of loyalty was complete submission to his perversions. Even the royal physicians and attendants began to whisper about the strange behavior of the king in his private life. Ferdinand's obsessions became darker, involving acts that shocked even the most jaded members of the court. Some chroniclers have described his preferences as grotesque, degrading, and entirely focused on exerting dominance over his wives, rather than love or companionship. Maria Antonia's life with Ferdinand was short and tragic. She died young, and rumors spread that she may have been poisoned, possibly with the involvement of Ferdinand himself. Whether true or not, her death cast a shadow over Ferdinand's reputation. But he showed no grief, no remorse, only the desire to replace her quickly and continue feeding his appetites. His subsequent marriages followed the same pattern. Young brides brought into the palace, only to be broken by the king's twisted demands. The women who became Ferdinand's queens were not partners in power. They were victims trapped in a gilded cage, forced to endure a man whose reputation grew darker with every passing year. Meanwhile, Spain was falling apart. The colonies in Latin America, inspired by independence movements and disgusted with Ferdinand's tyranny, began to break away. One by one, Spain's overseas possessions declared independence, and Ferdinand did nothing to stop it. His energy was not spent on saving the empire but on consolidating his absolute rule at home and indulging his perversions. The irony was staggering. The man once called the desired one was now despised, not only by liberals but by conservatives as well, for his incompetence, his cruelty, and his inability to secure Spain's future. Yet Ferdinand clung to power, using fear and repression to silence his critics. He surrounded himself with loyalists who enabled his every whim. No matter how perverse or destructive, by the later years of his reign, Ferdinand had transformed from a hopeful prince into the very symbol of Spain's decline. His name became synonymous with corruption, weakness, and depravity. He fathered no surviving children until his fourth marriage, and even then, the circumstances were surrounded by scandal. His daughter, Isabella II, would inherit a throne tainted by the sins of her father, setting Spain on a path of instability. That lasted decades. Ferdinand's personal corruption had become national corruption. His perversions, once whispered in private, were now legendary across Europe, earning him the reputation of the most perverted king in history. Part 1 of Ferdinand's story sets the stage for the horrors to come, from his scandalous birth and bitter childhood, to his betrayal of his father, to his humiliating captivity, and finally to his return as a tyrant king. Every step of Ferdinand's journey reveals a man more interested in feeding his obsessions than saving his people. The seeds of his perversions had been planted, and as the story unfolds, we will see just how far this king would go in pursuit of his darkest desires, and how his twisted legacy would scar Spain for generations. When Ferdinand VII returned to Spain in 1814, after years of captivity under Napoleon, his people were ecstatic. They believed that the suffering they had endured during the French occupation was finally over. Crowds filled the streets of Madrid, shouting "Viva el Rey!" as the carriages rolled past. The man once called El Deseado, the desired one, seemed to embody hope, the promise of stability, and the return of national pride. But the reality was far darker. Ferdinand stepped into power, not as a liberator but as a tyrant in disguise. He wore the crown like armor, using it not to protect his people but to indulge himself, shield his insecurities, and enforce his perverse desires. The applause of the people quickly faded as they began to witness the truth about their king. First signs came almost immediately. Ferdinand's advisors urged him to embrace the liberal constitution of 1812, a revolutionary document that gave Spain one of the most modern political systems in Europe. It limited royal authority, expanded the rights of citizens, and offered a pathway to reform. For a moment, the Spanish people believed their king would embrace this new vision. But Ferdinand despised it. He declared the constitution null and void, restoring absolute monarchy within weeks of returning. Those who had fought for freedom now found themselves hunted. Thousands of liberals were arrested, tortured, or executed. The prisons swelled, with writers, politicians, and even common citizens who dared to dream of change. Ferdinand showed his people that his vision of kingship was not one of service but domination, and if he could not control them through love, he would control them through fear. Yet, even as Spain's political climate darkened, The most disturbing aspects of Ferdinand's character revealed themselves in his private life. His obsession with control extended into the chambers of the palace, where he treated his wives as subjects of experimentation rather than companions. His first wife, Maria Antonia of Naples, had already endured humiliation and cruelty. Ferdinand, reportedly, forced her to participate in degrading acts designed not for intimacy but for his twisted amusement. He demanded that she submit completely, testing her loyalty through humiliation. The young queen's health began to deteriorate under the strain. In 1806, at the age of just 21, she died under mysterious circumstances. The court whispered of poisoning. Some accused Ferdinand himself, others blamed the queen's enemies, but the truth was never revealed. What mattered was the precedent it set. Ferdinand's marriages would become tragedies, each one leaving behind whispers of scandal, suffering, and death. After the death of Maria Antonia, Ferdinand remarried. His second wife was Maria Isabel of Portugal, another young princess brought to Madrid with hopes of stabilizing the dynasty. But Maria Isabel's fate was little different. She, too, became the subject of Ferdinand's twisted desires. Court documents and letters suggest that Ferdinand's behavior behind closed doors was grotesque even by the standards of royal excess. He was not a man of romance or even lust in the traditional sense. His fixation was humiliation and domination. He took pleasure in degrading those closest to him, and his wives were trapped in a cycle of fear and despair. Maria Isabel gave birth to children, but none survived. After several traumatic pregnancies, she died at the age of 21. Another young bride consumed by the palace and its monstrous king. By this time, whispers of Ferdinand's perversions were spreading beyond the palace walls. Courtiers, servants, and foreign ambassadors reported strange and unsettling behavior. Some described Ferdinand as a man obsessed with voyeurism and degradation. Others hinted at bizarre fetishes that shocked even the most decadent members of European aristocracy. He was said to demand acts that were not only humiliating but deeply unnatural, designed to feed his paranoia that no one truly loved him. To him, loyalty had to be proven, not with words but with submission to his most degrading fantasies. For the people of Spain, the stories became a grotesque reflection of their king's true nature. While famine, poverty, and political instability ravaged the country, Ferdinand lived in a cocoon of perversion, blind to his people's suffering. But Ferdinand's perversions did not exist in isolation. They directly impacted the kingdom he ruled. His obsession with controlling his wives mirrored his obsession with controlling Spain. Just as he humiliated his queens, he humiliated his subjects. He dismantled any institution that threatened his power, silenced voices of reform, and treated the nation as his personal possession. His paranoia about betrayal made him ruthless. He created networks of spies to root out dissent. Families lived in fear that a careless word could lead to imprisonment. Or worse, the prisons were full and the gallows never empty. Spain, once a proud empire, became a kingdom ruled by terror, all while its monarch indulged in scandals that shocked even his allies. Ferdinand's third marriage brought him to Maria Amalia of Saxony, a shy and deeply religious girl who entered the marriage terrified of her new husband. She was just 16 when she married Ferdinand, who by then was in his 30s. The union was a disaster from the beginning. Maria Josepha, raised in a strict Catholic environment, was horrified by Ferdinand's demands. She resisted his advances, clinging to her faith as her only shield. For Ferdinand, this resistance only intensified his obsession. He subjected her to psychological torment, forcing her to submit to his will. But unlike his previous wives, Maria Josepha never gave birth. She died in 1829, at the age of 25. Another life extinguished in the Palace of Horrors. The pattern was clear. Ferdinand's wives entered the marriage young, full of hope, and left the world broken, humiliated, and dead. By now, Ferdinand's reputation across Europe was one of disgust. He was not seen as a strong monarch but as a grotesque curiosity, a man who combined incompetence in governance with deviance in his private life. Diplomats described him as obese, lazy, and vulgar, a man more interested in food, sex, and domination than in the welfare of his people. His court became a theater of absurdity, where sycophants enabled his whims while the nation crumbled outside the palace walls. Spain's colonies in Latin America seized the opportunity to break free, declaring independence one after another. Mexico, Venezuela, Colombia, Argentina all slipped from Spain's grasp. Ferdinand made half-hearted attempts to suppress the revolutions, but failed miserably. His focus was never on saving the empire, but on saving his throne and feeding his twisted appetites. The once mighty Spanish Empire was reduced to fragments, and Ferdinand bore the blame. In 1829, desperate for an heir, Ferdinand married for the fourth time. His bride was Maria Cristina of Naples and Sicily, just 23 years old. Unlike his previous marriages, this union produced children. Maria Cristina bore him two daughters, Isabella and Luisa Fernanda. For the first time, it seemed Ferdinand might secure the dynasty's future. But even this marriage was riddled with scandal. Maria Cristina was rumored to despise her husband and took comfort in secret affairs, particularly with a royal guardsman. She tolerated Ferdinand only to protect her daughter's place in the succession. When Ferdinand's health began to decline, Maria Cristina maneuvered carefully, preparing for the moment when she would rule as regent for their young daughter Isabella. Her calculations were cold, but they were necessary. She knew enemies were many, and his death would unleash a storm of conflict over the throne. By the late 1820s, Ferdinand was a shadow of the man once cheered as El Deceiver. Obese, diseased, and increasingly grotesque, he became a caricature of excess. His body was ravaged by gout, his face bloated, his movements sluggish. He spent hours indulging in food and drink, his once fiery eyes dulled by age and gluttony. But his perversions did not fade. If anything, they grew more desperate as his body weakened. Unable to satisfy himself in the ways he once did, Ferdinand sank deeper into humiliation games, seeking to assert control even as his own health slipped away. The court became a circus of whispers, where servants snickered behind closed doors about the pathetic state of their king. To the people of Spain, he was no longer El Deseado, but El Rey Felon, the felon king, a monarch whose reign was marked by betrayal, cruelty, and perversion. And yet, Ferdinand clung to power. He fought desperately to secure the throne for his daughter, Isabella, even rewriting the laws of succession to allow her to inherit. This decision sparked outrage among conservatives, who rallied behind Ferdinand's brother, Don Carlos, as the rightful heir. The seeds of civil war were planted. When Ferdinand finally died in 1833, Spain was not a nation healed, but a nation divided. On the brink of decades of conflict, known as the Carlist Wars, his death was not a relief but the beginning of yet another era of instability, a testament to how deeply his failures had scarred the kingdom. Ferdinand's personal corruption had become national tragedy, his perversions echoing in the chaos that followed. By the time Ferdinand entered the final decade of his life, the Spain he ruled was no longer the Spain of his youth. The empire that had once stretched across continents was collapsing before his eyes. Mexico was gone, its revolution successful. Venezuela, Argentina, Colombia, Chile, Peru, all had broken free. The vast silver mines of the Americas that had once filled Spanish treasuries were lost forever. What remained was a weakened kingdom, ravaged by poverty, corruption, and political instability. The people struggled to survive famine, inflation, and economic ruin, while their king lived behind palace walls, indulging in his appetites and nursing his paranoia. To outsiders, Spain was a relic of a bygone era, and Ferdinand himself was the decaying symbol of its decline. Ferdinand, once hailed as El Deseado, had now earned a new title among his people, El Rey Felon, the Felon King. This name reflected not only his betrayal of the liberal constitution but also his betrayal of the nation itself. He had promised freedom and instead delivered repression. He had promised stability and instead left chaos. And yet, despite the hatred that grew against him, Ferdinand clung desperately to his throne, unwilling to relinquish even a fragment of his power. His obsession with control extended into every aspect of life. His ministers were puppets, his people were prisoners, and his own family were pawns in his endless games of domination. But by the 1820s, Ferdinand's greatest enemy was not rebellion or conspiracy, it was his own failing body. Years of indulgence had left him obese, swollen, and crippled by gout. He could no longer walk without assistance. His once sharp features were now buried beneath layers of flesh, his voice thick and slurred. Court witnesses described him as a grotesque figure, slumped on his throne, his legs bandaged, his face bloated, and his temper more violent than ever. When pain racked his body, he lashed out at those around him. Servants trembled, courtiers bowed in silence, and his young queen, Maria Cristina, endured his wrath with a cold patience. The king who had once inspired cheers now inspired only fear and disgust. Maria Cristina of Naples and Sicily, Ferdinand's fourth wife, entered his life in 1829. Unlike his previous wives, Maria Cristina was pragmatic. She understood the palace was not a place of love or safety, but a battlefield of survival. Ferdinand was nearly twice her age, diseased, volatile, and increasingly impotent. She tolerated his advances when necessary, but her true focus was on her daughters, Isabella and Luisa Fernanda. Maria Cristina played the role of loyal queen, but behind the scenes she cultivated alliances, secured her position, and quietly plotted for the future. She knew Ferdinand's death was inevitable, and when it came, the throne would pass to her child. To survive in a court full of enemies, she needed to be ready. The greatest obstacle was the law of succession. Spain had long followed Selic law, which barred women from inheriting the throne. If this law stood, Ferdinand's brother, Don Carlos, would inherit the crown upon the king's death. But Ferdinand, desperate to keep power in his immediate line, issued the Pragmatic Sanction in 1830, revoking Selic law and declaring that his daughter Isabella would succeed him. This decision split Spain into two camps. On one side were the Cristinos, supporters of Maria Cristina and young Isabella. On the other were the Carlistas, loyal to Don Carlos, who believed the throne was rightfully his. The seeds of a brutal civil war had been planted, all because of Ferdinand's obsession with controlling the future even as his own life slipped away. As Ferdinand's health worsened, the palace became a theater of intrigue. Ministers schemed, generals weighed their loyalties, and Maria Cristina maneuvered carefully, aware that her survival depended on her ability to outwit Don Carlos and his supporters. Ferdinand, meanwhile, descended deeper into paranoia. He feared betrayal at every corner. He ordered spies to monitor his own relatives, convinced that even Maria Cristina might conspire against him. The once powerful king was now a prisoner of his fears, trapped within the decaying walls of his palace. His body was failing, his empire was gone, and his people despised him. Yet he still clung to his throne, dragging Spain into further ruin. What shocked the people most was not merely Ferdinand's political failures but his unrelenting indulgence in perversion, even as his health collapsed. Reports circulated that the king, unable to perform in his later years, demanded increasingly grotesque forms of entertainment. He forced those around him into humiliating spectacles, taking pleasure not in intimacy but in domination. The palace became a den of whispered scandals, where servants spoke of strange nightly rituals, bizarre demands, and degrading acts. Ferdinand, too weak to govern effectively, still devoted energy to feeding his twisted appetites. His court was not a place of dignity but of debauchery, a grotesque reflection of the king's decayed soul. Outside the palace, Spain's people suffered. Crops failed, famine spread, and disease ravaged villages. Taxes rose to fund the king's extravagance, while soldiers were dispatched to silence protests. The Inquisition had been formally abolished, yet censorship and persecution remained strong under Ferdinand's rule. Writers and thinkers who dared to criticize the monarchy were silenced. Citizens lived under constant fear, their hopes for reform crushed again and again. For them, Ferdinand was not just a bad king, he was a curse upon the nation. His rule symbolized stagnation, humiliation, and decline. And yet, they were forced to endure him, praying that his death might finally bring change. By the early 1830s, Ferdinand's condition had become desperate. His legs were so swollen with gout that he could barely stand. His meals, rich with meat, wine, and sweets, only worsened his ailments. Physicians attempted to treat him with bleeding, poultices, and harsh purges, but nothing helped. His body was collapsing, and with it, the stability of the monarchy. Maria Cristina became the true power behind the throne, managing affairs while Ferdinand wasted away. She presented herself as a motherly figure, loyal to Spain and devoted to her children, but her political instincts were sharp. She understood that the moment Ferdinand died, chaos would erupt. Don Carlos and his supporters waited like vultures, ready to seize the throne. To protect Isabella's claim, Maria Cristina secured the support of liberals, offering concessions she knew Ferdinand would never have allowed. It was a gamble, but one she was willing to take. The king, meanwhile, was lost in his delusions. He believed he could still control Spain from beyond the grave. He issued decrees, changed laws, and summoned ministers, but his words carried little weight. Everyone knew the end was near. In September 1833, Ferdinand's condition worsened. Dramatically, confined to his bed, bloated, barely conscious, he lingered for days. The court was silent, waiting for the inevitable. On September 29, Ferdinand VII died at the age of 49. His death was not met with mourning, but with a grim sense of relief. The man who had once been El Decido left behind a legacy of betrayal, cruelty, and decay. Spain was not united but fractured, divided between Cristinos and Carlistas, with civil war looming on the horizon. Yet even in death, Ferdinand's shadow lingered. The Carlist wars that followed tore Spain apart for decades, costing countless lives. His decision to favor his daughter over his brother unleashed a conflict that would define Spanish politics for generations. His obsession with control had not preserved the monarchy but plunged it into deeper chaos. For his people, Ferdinand was remembered not as a savior but as the felon king, a man whose reign was marked by repression, perversion, and decline. And, for historians, he remains a figure of fascination, a monarch whose personal corruption became national tragedy, whose grotesque appetites symbolized the decay of an empire, and whose legacy was one of darkness rather than light. When Ferdinand VII finally died in September of 1833, Spain stood at a crossroads. The man who had once been hailed as the savior of the nation left behind only ruin, division, and bitterness. His body, bloated and broken from years of disease and indulgence, was laid to rest in the Escorial, the ancient burial site of Spanish kings. But his death did not bring peace. Instead, it unleashed the storm he had spent his final years trying desperately to control. With his passing, Spain entered one of the bloodiest and most turbulent periods of its history, and his legacy of cruelty and corruption lived on in the chaos he left behind. The crown now passed to his young daughter, Isabella II, who was just 3 years old, too young to rule. The burden of the throne fell on her mother, Queen Maria Cristina, who became regent. In a court filled with conspiracies and betrayal, Maria Cristina had to secure her daughter's throne against Ferdinand's brother, Don Carlos, who refused to accept Isabella as queen. To the Carlists, the pragmatic sanction Ferdinand had issued in 1830 was an illegal manipulation. They believed the throne was rightfully Carlos's by the law of succession. The battle lines were drawn. On one side were the loyal to Maria Cristina and Isabella, supported by liberals and reformists. On the other were the Carlists traditionalists, who wanted Carlos as king and who saw Isabella as a usurper. Ferdinand had wanted to shape the future even as his body rotted, and in doing so, he ensured Spain would bleed for decades. The First Carlist War erupted almost immediately after Ferdinand's death. Entire provinces rose in rebellion, especially in the Basque country, Navarre, and Catalonia, where loyalty to tradition was strongest. For many peasants, the fight for Don Carlos was not about a distant throne but about preserving the old ways of life, the church's authority, local privileges, and resistance to liberal reforms. The Carlist fighters, known as Requites, became feared guerrilla warriors, striking with ferocity and disappearing into the mountains. The Christ forces, loyal to the Queen, Regent, and Isabella, struggled to contain them. The war was not just a dynastic conflict, it was a civil war that tore communities apart, setting neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. Ferdinand's death did not end Spain's suffering, it deepened it. Maria Cristina, thrust into the role of regent, found herself trapped in the same prison of intrigue her husband had once controlled. She was clever and pragmatic, but she lacked Ferdinand's ruthless cruelty. To survive, she turned to the liberals, offering concessions Ferdinand would never have tolerated. She restored parts of the constitution he had destroyed, opened the door for reform, and aligned herself with those who wanted to modernize Spain. But her loyalty to reform was never wholehearted. She was not a visionary leader, she was a survivor, protecting her daughters in a kingdom ready to devour them. She relied on generals, politicians, and alliances to hold her fragile regency together. For the people, life remained harsh. The war drained resources, taxes rose, and hunger spread. Villages were burned, fields were trampled, and families were torn apart. In many places, the violence of the Carlist War seemed like an endless nightmare, and in every whispered story of suffering, the shadow of Ferdinand VII loomed. He was gone, but his decisions had created the very conflict destroying the nation. His refusal to allow meaningful reforms, his paranoia, and his obsession with control had set Spain on a path of blood and division. Even in death, he haunted his people. Historians often ask, what kind of man was Ferdinand VII? Some portray him as simply weak, a coward, manipulated by circumstance. But others insist he was far more dangerous, a man who reveled in cruelty, who thrived on humiliating those around him, who turned perversion into a weapon of power. His court was a theater of corruption, where loyalty was bought with favors and broken with punishments. His marriages were political contracts, his wives pawns in his games of control. His personal life was a grotesque reflection of his rule, indulgent, selfish, and destructive. He was the king who destroyed his own people while pretending to save them. Maria Cristina's regency eventually collapsed under the pressure of scandal and rebellion. Her secret marriage to Agustin Fernando Muñoz, a guardsman far below her station, became public knowledge. To the Carlists and conservatives, this was an unforgivable disgrace. To the liberals, it was proof that the regent cared only for herself. By 1840, Maria Cristina was forced to step down and flee into exile, leaving Spain in the hands of generals and politicians. Isabella, still a child, remained queen, but her throne was fragile, her reign destined to be filled with conspiracies, coups, and chaos. Ferdinand's decision to name her heir had not secured the monarchy, it had doomed it to instability for generations. The Carlist Wars dragged on in cycles throughout the 19th century. Each eruption of violence a reminder of Ferdinand's poisoned legacy. Thousands died in his name, whether fighting for his daughter or his brother. The monarchy itself became weaker with each conflict, its reputation tarnished by endless bloodshed. By the time Isabella II was deposed in 1868, Spain was exhausted, its people weary of royal promises that led only to betrayal. Ferdinand VII's name was rarely spoken with reverence. Instead, it became a curse, a symbol of failure, corruption, and perversion. And yet, Ferdinand remains one of the most fascinating figures in Spanish history precisely because of the contradictions he embodied. He was loved when he returned from exile, hated when he ruled, and feared when he died. He could have been remembered as a hero, the king who restored Spain after Napoleon, who gave his people freedom, who led the nation into a new era. Instead, he chose repression, paranoia, and cruelty. He clung to his throne even as his body rotted, even as his kingdom collapsed, even as his people begged for relief. In every decision, he revealed a man who valued power above all else. no matter the cost. To call him the most perverted king in history is not just to describe his personal life but to describe the perversion of his entire reign. He perverted the hopes of his people, turning their dreams of freedom into nightmares of repression. He perverted the laws of succession, leaving Spain in civil war. He perverted the sanctity of marriage, reducing his wives to victims of his cruelty. He perverted even the idea of kingship, turning the throne of Spain into a seat of humiliation and fear. His life was a tragedy not only for himself but for an entire nation, a dark reminder of what happens when a ruler destroys instead of protects, consumes instead of creates. Even today, his legacy lingers. Spanish history cannot be told without his shadow falling across it. Every Carlist uprising, every crisis of the 19th century, every rebellion that shook the monarchy all trace back to Ferdinand VII. He is remembered as the king who betrayed his people, the monarch who strangled his own nation, the ruler who embodied decay. And yet, his story captivates us because it reveals the dangerous intimacy between power and corruption, between desire and destruction. Ferdinand VII was not just a king, he was the embodiment of a kingdom's fall. As his story closes, one cannot help but reflect on the cruel irony of his reign. He began as El Decido, the desired one, the king the people prayed for. He ended as El Rey Phelan, the Phelan king, the monarch they cursed. His life is a warning carved into history, that power without virtue becomes poison, that cruelty disguised as authority leads only to ruin, and that even the mightiest throne can become a coffin for those who abuse it. Ferdinand VII, the most perverted king in history, left Spain, not with glory, but with scars, not with hope, but with grief, not with unity, but with endless division. His death may have ended his reign, but his ghost haunted Spain for generations, a dark specter of betrayal, corruption, and perversion that history will never forget.